So, I'm going to cover in 10 minutes, started my timer, civil nuclear energy, the intersection with non-proliferation, the regime that Jim talked about, and Iran as a case study. Piece of cake. So what I'm probably going to do is say a whole lot of times, we can get into this more in the Q&A, but let me give you a basic overview. So Jim talked about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I want to focus in on two of the articles of the Non-Proliferation Treaty because I think they significantly make a difference in how we talk about all these proliferation crises that we're dealing with in the world, of which there are no states that are pursuing nuclear weapons as a military program and we're trying to figure out how to dissuade them. There are a whole lot of states who are thinking about how, whether, and to what extent they're going to pursue nuclear technology. And then we have to ask ourselves the question, do we trust their motives, their motivation, which I think is different, and their explanations. The NPT Article 4, this is the one every time you hear anybody, a policymaker, a foreign official say every country under the NPT has the right to peaceful nuclear technology. This is what they're talking about. But I want to highlight, nothing in this treaty shall be interpreted as affecting the inalienable right, so not creating a right, but recognizing that there is some right that is otherwise existing out there in the ether, of all parties to the treaty to develop, research, production, and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes without discrimination and in conformity with Articles 1 and 2. So I'm not a lawyer, but in my mind, this means you don't get to do it no matter what. You only get to do it to the extent that the pursuit of peaceful nuclear technology is consistent with your commitment to, if you're a non-nuclear weapon state, not to pursue nuclear weapons, not acquire, develop, or otherwise have nuclear weapons. And then the second part of Article 4 is the one that's talking to the nuclear weapon state to say it's your obligation to help those countries that are agreeing not to make nuclear weapons, to help them with their nuclear technology. And again, it's all linked to paragraph 1. This jumps us immediately into the challenge of dual-use material, which I'm going to leave the most of the discussion of that to Melissa. I just want to talk about two concepts. One is this very kind of detailed, technically detailed argument about what is dual-use equipment or material. Sometimes it can be material that helps you with a nuclear technology. That we call related material. This is a picture of a heavy water ice cube in the left glass versus a light water, or as we call water, ice cube on the right glass. Specialized equipment like a flow-forming machine that might be used to make a nuclear component. And then the component materials themselves that go into this equipment, miraging steel, which can also be used in golf clubs, and carbon fiber, which is also used in Formula One cars. So the point is that all of these things are components of things that can be used for nuclear purposes, can also be used for perfectly reasonable civilian technology. I want to set that all aside, because the fundamental challenge of dual use in the context of what I talked about on Article 4 is that nuclear technology itself is a dual-use technology, meaning it's the exact same as what we heard yesterday from Caitlin. It's the exact same process to enrich uranium for weapons as it is to enrich uranium for nuclear energy. It's the exact same process to produce plutonium for mixed oxide fuel, to close the fuel cycle, as you heard yesterday, as it is to make the plutonium for a nuclear weapon. So it's the problem is we cannot say this stuff good, this stuff bad, end of story. And so as long as we're dealing in basically an entirely technological gray area, then we need to think about policy. So then that gets us to Article 3. So this is the NPT's recognition that, gosh, if we're going to recognize that there are legitimate peaceful uses of technology, we better figure out how we're going to feel comfortable with all that being out there in the world. And this is the basis for what you all have probably heard lots of times, safeguards. Safeguards, the process by which we assure ourselves, whoever the we is, the international community, a national government, an expert, that we assure ourselves that a country that has nuclear technology, which is inherently dual use, is not using it for nuclear weapons purposes. And this is a long paragraph. But the key things highlighted in red is each non-nuclear weapon state policy accepts safeguards under the International Atomic Energy Agency for the exclusive purpose of verifying its obligations under this treaty. That's not pursuing a nuclear weapon. So that is kind of our favorite phrase, right? Trust but verify. And I actually hate this because I don't think trust has anything to do with verification. You can verify somebody you do not trust at all. You can trust somebody implicitly and therefore say you don't need to verify. I think that we get wrapped around trust but verify, and I think we just need to focus on verify. Whatever that takes, we just need to verify. So how has safeguards evolved? This is something that Jim started to mention, and I'll go into just the very basics. Again, we can go into Q&A a little bit more. Insert 66, that was the first version of safeguards, and that is what we call facility specific, meaning I sell you a nuclear power plant and I say, if I'm going to be comfortable with you having this nuclear power plant, you need to have safeguards on it. And the International Atomic Energy Agency says, okay, we will come put safeguards on that plant. And all they're saying is, at this plant, within these boundaries, we say that what you have there is there, and it's not going someplace else. That's it. The next generation was what we have tended to call comprehensive safeguards, which, by the way, are not at all comprehensive. But comprehensive safeguards says that it's comprehensive to the whole country. So it's no longer whatever you're doing in this plant, I now know, but whatever's going on in the rest of the country, I have no basis for. It's to say, I want to look at all nuclear material production capability in your country, more specifically, where you are actually producing nuclear material. So what you say you've produced, that is how much you've produced, and it's all still where you say it's going to be. What happened? You heard about Iraq. This is the first kind of major example of a crisis creating a change in the international safeguard system. This is just an example where there was a site in Iraq called Tuwaifa. It had a lot of stuff going on. It was a pretty diverse nuclear site. And this just shows how the site grew. The little circle is only to be a point of reference. It's not designed to be and actually the circle's in the wrong place there. So terrible reference point, ignore that. The circle should be right there. But it just shows that the site grew over time. All under traditional safeguards, all Iraq had to do was to continue to say that the places that I have declared where there is nuclear material, you can come and confirm that that nuclear material is still there. And the inspectors could be on the ground, and they used to go on the ground and look at that first picture, and then they see there are a lot more buildings, and then they see there's a lot more buildings. What actually happened at Tuwaifa was everything highlighted in red was a clandestine facility. It was within the same boundary. It was using a lot of the same people. But the inspectors had no right to say, I know I'm in this room, but what's going on over there? And how come all the people that are working on this really cool technology keep going over there when they work in the afternoon? The IAEA had no right to ask those questions and pursue that in a traditional sense. They did have the right to go back to Vienna and say, there's something going on here, and we need to ask for a special inspection. And this is where the politics comes in again. The burden for that was so high, it would create such a crisis that the inspectors really didn't feel empowered to do that. So what happened? We had clandestine activity. So then we got to Insert 540, which which is also called the Additional Protocol, strengthened safeguards. This was completed in 1997. So we just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Additional Protocol, and it's voluntary. Any country with a traditional safeguards agreement has to go further and agree to have an additional protocol, and not all of them have. More than 100 have, but there are a few key countries that still have not concluded an additional protocol. And what the additional protocol does is it says, all right, state, you have to give us a whole lot more information. So because they said there's no way we can conclude that you're not pursuing something clandestinely based on the information you've provided us. You need to give us a whole lot more. And now we're going to try to tell the whole story of the country. And some of that has to do with more regular short notice inspections, 2-hour, 2-day inspections in some cases. But it's not just about inspections. It's really about information. If you think about strength and safeguards, it's really about information. So that I can't just go to this, the site that's been declared and say, well, everything seems copacetic, check, 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 check. I now say, yeah, everything seems fine here, but based on the information you've given me, this doesn't seem to match the scale of what is going on. And then we get to additional protocol plus or Iran style safeguards. So here I'm going to transition a little bit to Iran. What I want to give, just make one point out of this slide, the joint plan of action. This was the first Iran deal. And this was kind of the test. Could a JCPOA be possible? And what had to happen here was that there had to be a freeze and rollback of activities, and there had to be strength and verification. And there were hard timelines. And it was basically a proof of concept that this kind of agreement with Iran could go forward, and it gave the negotiators time to figure out what's the entire scope. But what it did, and this is what I wanted to focus, is that it led to this concept of really focusing on breakout time. And this came out yesterday, and we can talk about it more in the Q&A. But the way the breakout time is defined in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the current Iran deal, is it's the amount of time that it would take Iran to produce a first bomb's worth of nuclear material. And the basis for the negotiation, the U.S. policy instruction that was shared by the others, was that they wanted the JCPOA to get them a 1-year breakout time for the first 10 years of the deal. Basically saying, give us 10 years where we don't have to worry about Iran being able to have enough material for a nuclear weapon in a matter of weeks or even a few months. Give us 10 years where we can work with Iran, recognizing that implementing the deal was going to be complicated, the verification was going to be complicated, and where we can always say we've got a year. Because a year is not about a technical barrier. A year is about a political process to say if you know you have about a year, then as soon as you see things going south, you have time to get the consensus back together, get the coalition back together. Because a year also means that they're doing it in a way that is completely obvious. A year is not about secret. A year is about we're breaking out of the deal, we're going to take all of our material out from under this extra monitoring, and we're going for it. So that's what breakout timeline is. I brought this chart. I'll just distribute it for everybody. And this is a kind of, and again, I don't expect you to read it, so that's why I'm going to hand it out. But what I wanted to use this chart is to focus on a few of the myths that are currently out there about the Iran deal. Myth 1, that the Iran deal pushed the goalpost back, but created a point of time in the future where Iran is allowed to pursue a nuclear weapon. It's not true. It is fundamentally a mischaracterization of not just the deal, but the Non-Proliferation Treaty also. Because first of all, Iran stays part of the NPT. And you could say, okay, that's great, what did it matter? They were doing bad things before under the NPT, why wouldn't they do it again? The NPT doesn't have enforcement. The deal has enforcement. The NPT also doesn't have inspection laid out. As Jim said, and as I highlighted, all it says is there has to be some sort of safeguards. It doesn't say what those safeguards are. The deal has safeguards, additional protocol, plus the strengthened elements, and the 24-day rule to be able to get into any suspect site in Iran. And again, we can get into why that matters. You'd say 24 days. They can hide anything in 24 days. We can argue about that. I don't think it's the case. So 24 days with the enhanced additional protocol. And also, it's not just about the nuclear material. That's important. But the deal also prohibits in perpetuity the pursuit by Iran of certain technologies related to the actual making of a nuclear weapon. That is not anywhere in any international agreement. And that is a permanent constraint on Iran under the deal. So my argument would just be, before we say that the deal is flawed, let's get rid of it, or to say that somehow magically in 10 years or 15 years we lose the value of the Iran deal, I think that there are certain things that last permanently, that as long as we're in it, we can hold Iran accountable to it. And those permanent restrictions actually matter if we're looking at the future capability of Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. And I think they're fundamentally misunderstood. So I'm just going to wrap up, leaving with a few things that we can talk about later. You know, I've talked about this mix between technology and policy. You know, this is an example of technology. JCPOA, the negotiations happened when Iran was around 19,000 centrifuges. That was described publicly as giving, and with enough enriched uranium inventory to give them the capability to have the material for a nuclear weapon in the period of a couple of months. After the JPOA was signed, it went down to 12,000. That's when I talk about that test case. That was the sample, right? Having got the sample, we wanted to buy the full deal. So with the JCPOA in force, there are 5,060 installed centrifuges. The key thing is that centrifuges by themselves don't matter. You can have the most brilliant, and I mean they matter, I care. But you could have the most brilliant, you could have all 19,000 of these centrifuges, but without the feed material to go into it, they can't enrich any uranium, they can sit there and spin. So the key thing about the 5,060 centrifuges, and what gets us to that breakout timeline, is that it's a pairing of the centrifuges with the material. So you could have more centrifuges and less material, you could have fewer centrifuges and more material. All those are kind of sliders that you can set off against each other. The key is at 5,060 centrifuges and the constraint that is tiny, but right here in the blue box, no more than 300 kilograms of uranium, none of which can be enriched higher than 3.67% of U-235. Those are the two, where those two sliders, for us, balanced at that breakout timeline that we wanted to preserve. And finally, again, I can go into this in more detail, but I do want to say that international monitoring and verification in Iran is unlike anywhere else in the world. It is not traditional safeguards, comprehensive safeguards, and it's not even additional protocol. There are things happening, and this little blue box is a good example of a technical tool that is being deployed in Iran and nowhere else in the world right now. And what it is it's a box that clamps onto a tube, the pipe that goes in between the centrifuges, that can actually measure in real time at any moment what is the enrichment of that uranium gas going through that pipe. That's nowhere else in the world. And that's so you can be sure that they're not enriching to a higher level and then putting in a secret pipe and piping it off another way. I mean, there are ways we can have safeguards against that, but this is the best way to know the enrichment level in the pipe at any given time. And that's important because traditional safeguards, and in most cases it's perfectly good, they measure the output. It all comes into a big cylinder at the end, and you sample from that, and you say, yep, here's what the enrichment level is. But this means they can never be enriching up above that 3.67%. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm happy to take questions on the technical elements of the deal, the political context for the deal, and then obviously what I really care about is this is the kind of current state-of-the-art example of how are we trying to manage a fuel cycle dual-use technology problem in real time. So, thank you.